From St. Louis Public Radio, this is Politically Speaking.
Former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill spent more than 30 years in elected office before leaving the U.S. Senate in 2019. But she's reinvented herself as a prominent political commentator on MSNBC. And on the latest episode of Politically Speaking, McCaskill sits down with me for an extensive interview about her career, the changing media landscape, and the state of the Missouri Democratic Party. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
We have to talk about things that matter to people.
I've tried to bring that same aggressive iconoclast style with me to the United States Senate.
I think my district is a model for the state.
We put Missourians first.
You just kind of have to find the common ground with people.
I believe that this district deserves someone who represents their values.
After I came back to St. Louis, I started thinking that I could have a bigger role on the change that I wanted to make.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. I am in a Kirkwood St. Louis bread company, not Panera, by the way, with a very special guest today.
Hi, it's good to be with you, Jason, and welcome to Kirkwood.
Yeah, it's former Senator Claire McCaskill. You're kind of from everywhere. Like, you grew up in rural Missouri, you were elected from Kansas City. I guess you probably lived in Jefferson City, Central Missouri when you were a statewide official, but you've been in St. Louis for a while. Now that you're not in elected office anymore, can you say which part of the state you like living in best?
Well, listen, St. Louis has a lot I love. Primarily my husband and 5 of my 7 children, and 11 of my almost 14 grandchildren. So there's a lot to love here. I have a very special place in my heart for Kansas City. I went there after law school. I didn't have any family there. I didn't have any political connections. And Kansas City welcomed me, and that's where I began my political career and had maybe my favorite all-time job, which was Jackson County prosecutor. So it's hard for me to pick. Picking between Kansas City and St. Louis is like picking between my kids. I really can't do it very well. One has the Chiefs I love, one has the Cardinals I love, so it's a close call.
I have a personal question for you. I moved to Missouri when I was 18 from suburban Chicago, and I've lived here more than half of my life. Does that make me a Missourian?
It does to me,
okay.
but unfortunately, probably to too many Missourians, it does not. We are not probably going to be in the top 10 states welcoming people from other places. It's a pretty insular state in that way.
Here's the reason I asked that question. My kids were born here, so I don't know if they are now back to being first-generation Missourians or they're fifth-generation Missourians, because my family grew up in St. Louis and Kansas City, and I think that they deserve to know for continuity's sake what number generations
Tell
they
them
are.
fifth.
I'm going to say fifth. So when they run for office.
And there won't be enough journalists around to call them on it if they run for office.
I know Jason Kander, because he grew up in Kansas and then moved to Missouri, got called on that. And it generally confused me because I love this state, even though I have fondness for Illinois. But we're not here to talk about generations. We're here to talk about a lot of things. And the first thing I want to talk about is what you're doing now. You have been, I guess, an MSNBC political commentator since you left office in 2019. And I think I've said this to you before. I've really enjoyed watching this transition. I know that you're not universally beloved by everybody, which I think we'll talk about, but it's just been really fun to watch you kind of take on this new role. And I want to get a sense of like what you have to do in order to be on MSNBC all the time.
Mostly I just have to be myself, which is, it feels like in some ways white-collar crime because I love politics. I know it very, very well. I did it my whole life. I've done it my whole life. I'm a talker, and although I probably wasn't always as candid as I wanted to be, I was proud of the fact that I typically would actually answer questions, and I would make myself very, very accessible to the press, and didn't shy away from going places where there were going to be people challenging me and asking me hard questions. I mean, you don't do 50 town halls in rural Missouri without coming away with a few scars if you're somebody like me. So what they're really doing is they're paying me to talk about something I love and to be incredibly candid and hopefully be able to simplify complicated things for the viewers of MSNBC. And it's been a blast. I hope people can tell how much fun I'm having. It is, I'm way happier than I thought I would be. I actually was worried because I had been on that, almost like a hamster wheel. When you are doing politics in Missouri, particularly if you're a young woman and you're a Democrat, it is hard.
Because you started in 1982, right?
In 1982, in my 20s, is when I first ran for office. And, it was never, the pressure was never ending. The commitments were never ending. The schedule was never my own. And so I assumed when I quit doing it, there would be this big vacuum in my life. And nothing has been further from the truth. I have been busy and happy, and I feel guilty. I've said this over and over again, but I almost feel guilty. I'm so happy.
Well, I mentioned I personally like watching you. I particularly appreciated when there was the second impeachment, and you were telling the viewers, I don't think they're going to go through with calling witnesses because it's going to be a whole lot of work for not a lot of results, which was not a popular opinion because I think a lot of people wanted witnesses. I think that I even put out a tweet that said it may be good to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. But it seemed that I don't know whether you had inside information in the Senate, or you just knew how Chuck Schumer and everybody worked. But I think you were pretty dead on about what was going to happen. And I think maybe just explain that particular point of why that experience in the Senate can be helpful on instances like that.
Well, I am old-fashioned in many ways, and one of the ways I'm old-fashioned is that I see my time in politics as a time where I made really good friends, a bunch of them, really good, close friends. And I am blessed that many of them remain in the Senate. And as long as I am careful about what I say and how I say it in regards to what they share with me, I don't ever want to, obviously violate a private conversation I have with my former colleagues. I find out a lot of stuff, and that is valuable in what I do now. I also know a lot of stuff about how it works. And Chuck Schumer, I know very, very well. Chuck Schumer and I talk almost every week, and we have, I'm very close friends with both him and his wife, Iris. In fact, just had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago when I was in New York. And so it gives me the opportunity, as long as I don't abuse it, to know a lot of what is happening and how it's going to happen, so that I can share with the viewers.
I mentioned the feedback because it's not always been 100% positive. Even though I would classify you, I know that you tried to message yourself as a centrist to Missouri voters, but on a lot of issues, I think you take mainline Democratic positions. You were for abortion rights, you were for gun control, you came out for gay marriage in 2013. But it seems like a lot of people, especially on the left, people who are fans of Bernie Sanders, sometimes tweet at you very angry things because I don't think that you're left enough for them. I want you to kind of elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Most of the people who do that have either never been to Missouri or never been outside of the very blue areas of Missouri. I used to tease my friends, Emanuel Cleaver and Lacey Clay, before you chew on me, why don't you come with me to Pettis County? Why don't you mosey down to the Boot Heel with me? And it's not that I needed to win those areas, but I had to cut the margins. I had to talk about things that were relatable to people outside of the urban areas. And I navigated that pretty well and had a really progressive voting record. I think the only thing that bugs me, I don't care about the hate. I mean, I've got skin thicker than a 200-year-old oak tree. I mean, I've got some really thick bark on me. I don't care about that. What I care about is this ridiculous notion that had seemed to take root after the election, that if I'd only been more liberal, I would have won. If I'd only been, more progressive, I would have won. And first of all, it's flat not true, because all you have to do is look at the numbers. I mean, we rang the bell in Kansas City and St. Louis.
I think I actually compared your numbers to 2006 because I think that was the fairest comparison. And you actually did better in largely black areas of St. Louis, especially. I don't think I looked at Kansas City, but I think it was also
Both
the
places.
same.
I mean, I had 8,000 more votes than Lacey Clay did. So when I lost in 2018, now he ended up losing 2 years later, but this wasn't a problem of turnout in progressive areas of the state. It wasn't a problem of margins in black communities or any other communities. We far exceeded our numbers. This was all about people turning out that totally bought into Donald Trump. And Donald Trump camped out here, as you remember. So Donald Trump, not Josh Hawley, gets credit for that win and credit for an almost 6-point margin.
He had much more message discipline than Todd Akin did. Do you think that also played a role, that he didn't, implode like your prior opponent and pick the right messages in order to prevail?
I think that Todd Akin was authentic to who he was. Todd Akin was exactly what you saw. He believed everything he said. I think if I were to sum up Josh Hawley, it would be he's not very authentic. He is, I'm not sure I know what he truly believes in, and I'm not sure he knows what he truly believes in.
I want to stick with the topic of media because I have now worked in the Missouri political journalism area for 15 years. I'm only 36, but I started when I was 22, and a lot has changed how I cover both state and federal politicians. And I could explain my perspective, and I probably will, but I want to hear how you think things have changed.
If I had to pinpoint one thing that I was most worried about, and there's a lot of areas that I could go to here, but I am really worried about journalism in the political arena. I mean, if I think back, Jason, when I went to Jefferson City, there were probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 journalists covering Jefferson City just for the 3 major metropolitan, 4. There were 4 major metropolitan newspapers: the Globe, the Post-Dispatch, the Star, and I don't even remember the name of the Kansas City Star. And when I was prosecutor, there were half a dozen reporters covering the courthouse and the police department and the court system. Now, as you well know, I can count on one hand the full-time Missouri journalists who I think know Missouri politics, on one hand. And that's for the whole state, to say nothing of what is going unreported in courthouses and police departments, and everywhere else in the community. So I grew up knowing that if I did something wrong, it was going to be reported on. If someone else was corrupt, they would be found out by journalists. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think, I remember the day during the middle of the pandemic when the Missouri legislature legalized brass knuckles. Now think about that. It is in the middle of a crisis of public health that our country had not seen in my lifetime. There were all kinds of things that needed to be addressed. And they were passing legislation to legalize brass knuckles. Now, in my day, that would have been, I would use an unladylike word right now, but it starts with an S and it ends with show. Because the journalists would have been, they would have been highlighting why they were doing this, who was doing it, what was the need to legalize brass knuckles, and what is going unaddressed. But it passed with barely a notice. And that to me was a startling revelation of how far we've fallen in terms of the ability of a hollowed out press corps to cover the things that people need to know about, particularly in the state legislature.
Well, I have obviously a lot of thoughts on this because when I started in 2006, I worked for the Columbia Daily Tribune. And back then, that paper was pretty robust, and someone like me was pretty well supported to do a lot of different things. Like, I worked there for 2.5 years. I went to Hannibal Days twice. I went to Lincoln Days, no matter whether it was in Springfield or Branson or St. Louis. During the 2008 presidential contest, I traveled to Rolla to see Barack Obama, which was, think about that now, like a Democratic presidential candidate. I remember that. And I also got to see like John McCain and Sarah Palin in St. Charles. I could say a lot of things about that job that didn't end well, but I can say that my editors supported me doing the things that needed to do to cover the political environment here. And I just learned a ton, not only about statewide politics, but rural Missouri politics. You probably hear me all the time talk about, why have Democrats done so bad in Northeast Missouri? Because I was up in Northeast Missouri covering it. Now, I think there's not as much support for journalists to do those types of things because the newspaper industry in particular has collapsed. The Columbia Tribune is a shell of its former self after it got bought by Gatehouse and now Gannett, and a lot of the other newspapers are the same way. And I'm not saying public radio is immune from a lot of these financial issues, but I think a lot of it just is from the financial constriction of journalism that has a lot of complicating factors to it. I'm not sure if you have a response to that.
Well, I think you're right. I think it's really true that, and the other thing that has happened in journalism is in order for the business model to work, you've got to get clicks. You've got to find something that's viral. The deadlines are immediate. I mean, I'm so old, I remember when we knew that if we were going to get something in the morning paper, it had to be there by 10 o'clock at night. Mm-hmm. Well, those days are long gone.
Or try getting something in the afternoon paper by 10:30 or 11.
Exactly.
I honestly don't miss that, by the way. But
well, but the point is that it not only is the press corps hollowed out in terms of expertise and just boots on the ground ability to cover everything that needs to be covered because there's not enough of them, they also are being driven by algorithms instead of by what is a long story that needs to be written that's complicated so people understand it. That investigative, when I think back to the Terry Gainey's and the Virginia Youngs and the Steve Kraskes and the Joe Mannies of the world, especially, if you look back at it, and even, there's some reporters in Kansas City that were really well known for long investigative pieces that changed things. I mean, that put people in prison, that did the kinds of things that I think readers want, but there's no money in it now.
Right, and no matter which model you follow, there's pitfalls. So if you have a commercial media outlet, it's completely at the mercy of what the economy is in advertisers. If you have a nonprofit model like St. Louis Public Radio, the Missouri Independent, it's also dependent on donors, and there's always going to be instances where people are like, oh, that entity is donating to you, your coverage is biased. Like when I worked for the St. Louis Beacon, I think Rex Singfeld gave us, $10,000, $20,000. So we had to put on, after every article we wrote about him, that he was a donor. And people were probably like, Rex Singfeld is
behind this.
Yeah. And even like a situation like the Washington Post where Bezos bought it, like that doesn't necessarily mean that those papers have unlimited money, because those business people expect like efficiency. I think that if we're gonna get through this, and I don't know if we will, I don't think the newspaper will exist in 10 or 15 years the way it is now. I think big papers will. I think small regional papers are going to disappear, which I think is very problematic for a lot of reasons. It's kind of going to be up to news consumers to decide that our work is worth paying for. It's all about money, and I wish it was more about like philosophical enterprise, but journalists need to get paid, and if there's no money coming in, we're a lot more constricted.
That's exactly right, and I think that's what worries me the most, because and I talked on David Simon, who wrote The Wire, who was a beat reporter at the police department in Baltimore, and he and I talked about this in a hearing. The institutional knowledge of reporters that are covering local and state government, that is going to go away. And Katie barred the door because it's already Looney Tunes.
Right.
It's going to get much worse.
I mean, I've had 15 years of experience, and I'm one of the most experienced Missouri political reporters in the state, and I don't think that's a good thing.
No.
I do want to ask about like social media and the rise of technology, because social media has become this all-consuming thing in information dissemination and journalism, and you have actually kind of dove in head first with your Twitter account. I think you had a Tumblr for a while. What's kind of your view on how social media has changed not only news media, but just politics in general? Because I think that has had a big impact over how people consume information.
I think it's good and bad. I was one of the first senators to have a Twitter account. Took a great deal of ribbing about it in the caucus. I used to walk into caucus and, people would just start making fun of me. I remember Dick Durbin saying, "Oh, Claire, are you going to tweet what you had at Taco Bell yesterday?" And, stuff like that. And I kept trying to explain to them it was like a public bulletin board. And if you want to communicate with people, just think of it as putting something up on a public bulletin board, and then you're going to be fine. I remember Dianne Feinstein saying, "Well, I don't want my privacy invaded." I go, "Well, Dianne, do you send out a Christmas card?" And she said, "Well, yes." And I go, "Well, what's the difference? That's you trying to communicate publicly to the people that you work for." Mm-hmm. And so clearly the ability to communicate, especially with authenticity, if you do it yourself.
Because you do it yourself. A lot of lawmakers have their staff do it.
Right.
And I think that there are pros and cons to that. The con is it doesn't sound very authentic. The pro is that especially if you're a senator, and I know senators are very, very busy, they can focus on doing senatorial things as opposed to tweeting.
Well, I think communicating with the people I worked for was pretty damn important.
Yeah.
I thought it was more important than me spending another 15. And it doesn't take any time.
Right.
It's just what's on your mind. And so I loved it that I wasn't edited. My staff never saw what I tweeted before it went out. And I made mistakes, but they were authentic mistakes.
Right.
My most embarrassing one was when I said, I think it's time that we really I don't remember what the context of the tweet was, but I said pubic option instead of public option. And
we've all done that.
Right. It was an authentic mistake, and it got a lot of attention at the time, but who cares? It was not that big a deal.
Do you think it's good, though, that we have a president now who clearly is not tweeting? His staff is clearly tweeting, and I think that I'm not going to deny that Donald Trump's social media use had a positive impact for his political pursuits. But obviously it had a lot of other negative ramifications too. Are you okay with Biden just letting others tweet for him?
I'd be fine if Biden tweeted himself, as long as it wasn't something that he was doing at 2 a.m, and as long as he wasn't lying as often as other people brush their teeth. Mm-hmm. The problem with Trump tweeting was not that he was tweeting. The problem with him tweeting was that he lied constantly and said things that were irresponsible and harmful to the public discourse. He really took the presidency to a place that I didn't think any president in my lifetime would do that. And so, I think it's fine that a president doesn't tweet, but I don't think that we should ever decide that Trump is the model for a presidency tweeting, because he was not a model for anything when it comes to ethical or honest communication.
One red flag early on, and this was in 2015, it wasn't a tweet, but he did an interview with somebody, and he called Ferguson one of the most dangerous cities in the world, along with Oakland and other cities. And having covered Ferguson pretty extensively, that was a huge red flag, because if you actually go to Ferguson, I'm not saying that there's not crime there. It is not more dangerous than Kabul, Afghanistan, or places in Mexico. It's a suburb of St. Louis.
Well, first of all, it's a lot less dangerous than many other places in Missouri.
Right.
Much less comparing it with dangerous. That was just him lying, and that was a dog whistle for race.
Right.
He was trying to tell everyone, if black people are there, it's dangerous.
But here's why that was so
disgusting.
impactful. When I would say, this is not true, people would then try to say, yes, it is true. Look at this statistic here. Look at this statistic there. I mean, it really did have an impact on how people perceived things. And that was just one example. And
well, the biggest example we have now is the big lie.
Right.
I mean, that's going to have permanent and lasting impact on our elections, what he has done and what he continues to do with the support of every Republican elected official in Missouri. Every single one.
I do want to talk about that because I'll say into this microphone, Joe Biden won the election. I don't even really think the election was that close. I know some states were, but like he won Michigan by more than Trump. I think he won Pennsylvania pretty solidly. Yes.
By more than Trump?
By Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia were very close. But he won. And I have covered elections before that got overturned because of election abnormalities. The Bruce Franks Penny Hubbard race and the Susan Carlson Stacey Newman race. You have to reach a threshold where the irregularities would impact the election, and there was never even close to anything that proved that. So I'm saying that I'm not saying some people say or anything. I'm saying that because that's based off my experience. With that being said, I can guarantee you there are a lot of regular Missourians who do not believe that. And if a member of Congress or a U.S. Senator said what I just said, they would get primaried and they would probably lose because this is a base problem. So I want you to address that reality. Even if what I said is true, people just aren't absorbing that.
Well, that's what was so frustrating about the big lie, is that the excuse that was given by primarily Josh Hawley is who did it in the Senate. I mean, he does get credit. He should get credit for causing January 6th because he was the senator that broke ranks in order to play to the base and to play to the Trump people. The rest of the senators weren't going to do that. McConnell had succeeded in explaining to them that there was no good that was going to come of it. Josh Hawley did it, and he did it for blatantly political reasons. And the irony was, the excuse was, well, people want us to look into it because there were irregularities. No, people wanted you to look into it because they'd been lied to. They'd been lied to. And those guys all know it. They all know they were lied to. So it is really astounding to me that they are continuing this. Now, let's talk about it in the context of Missouri. I will give you that right now, standing up to the big lie would cause Missouri Republicans problems in primaries. And I would even give you that right now in Missouri, that somebody who is lying, winning a primary in most legislative districts, state legislative districts, will still be able to win their election. But the time will come, if they continue down the road they're going down, where they are playing to the cheapest of seats, where they are overturning the will of the people on Medicaid expansion, where they're going even further and cutting Medicaid, the time will come when there are districts, whether it's in Jefferson County or whether it's in Warren County or whether it's in St. Charles County or Cass County or Platte County, that those districts will begin to turn more and more purple, and the right candidate will be able to win those seats. And when that starts happening, then you'll see some kind of moderation of the crazy stuff they're doing in Jefferson City. But for right now, in Missouri, this primary calculation will work for them. I don't think it's going to work nationwide. I think that the people in the Senate are making a mistake. I think the people in the House are making the mistake, because I think independent voters and sane Republican voters, together with vast Democratic majorities, is a mathematical equation that will be very hard to overcome by people who have embraced the big lie. I mean, I think Liz Cheney is right. I think they're going down a dangerous path for the future writ large of the Republican Party.
Well, what's the incentive for them not to do that? I mean, after Josh Hawley did what he did on January 6th, a lot of people thought his political career was over, and then he has like a huge fundraising quarter. It seems like he's not really that vulnerable in 2 years if he runs for re-election. And there are other people that voted to object who probably aren't vulnerable either. like, what's their incentive for doing anything else if they're not challenged electorally for this?
Well, the old-fashioned me says doing the right thing ought to come back in fashion, relying on the facts instead of just lying. But I don't think Josh Hawley will ever be president of the United States, and that's what he was gunning for. Pardon the expression. He was trying to. He has been on a path of. Hey, listen, I'm not going to give anybody trouble for being ambitious. I was a very ambitious young woman, and it served me well through decades of political life. But his ambition is so blinding that he has gone so quickly from swearing off politicians to being the most power-hungry politician maybe in Missouri's history, that he actually believed by doing what he did, it would put him in a good place to run for president. I don't think it's done that.
I do have to ask this question. You only lost to two people in your career. One was Josh Hawley and one was Matt Blunt. It seems like from this interview and from social media, you're a lot more publicly critical of Josh Hawley than other people you run against for win or lose. I want to ask why, because I think that every time you've run since 2004, they've used the same archetype against you, that you're like this rich, out-of-touch lady and your husband's a slumlord, basically. That's been the same thing every time. I'm not saying it's true, but it doesn't seem like you hold the animus against Matt Blunt or Jim Talent for doing that, but it seems like you aren't very fond of Josh Hawley for running essentially the same campaign. I'd like to know why.
Well, the only regret I have about my political career is how unfair it was to my husband. I will say that just up front.
Right.
Terribly unfair. In fact, Susan Collins was moaning to me during her election this time about what they were doing to her husband, and I said, "Are you kidding me? You want to talk to me about what they do to your husband?"
Don't a lot of Republicans like your husband too?
Oh yeah, he's a great, honest.
I think Kit Bond was like, "I'm excited for Claire McCaskill to come in because I've known her husband for years,
yeah,
and I'm a big fan of his."
They loved him. I mean, I used to make the joke that my husband is the kind of guy that, self-made, first job out of school in a steel mill, created thousands of jobs, been wildly successful. He is the archetype of what Republicans love, except he was married to me.
Right.
So then he became a tax cheat and son of a bitch. So
but continue. Yeah.
Continue. Here's the thing. Politics is hard, and I know that when you run for big offices, it's going to be very unfair. In fact, my father told me right before he died, just remember, honey, what you've chosen to do is never going to be fair. And so that's, you take that in stride. Josh Hawley's a little different. He wouldn't go into St. Louis and do a town hall. He won't ever. He limited what he would say and when he would say it. He was the first candidate I ran against that I frankly thought was kind of dangerous in terms of the way he viewed what he was doing. The cold calculation. And also, I'm not in politics anymore, and I'm never going to be again.
Yeah.
So I am freed up now, and I spent a long time after the election and didn't say anything about Josh Hawley. It's just when he became, head of the Looney Tunes in terms of let's fist pump the insurrection rather. But I knew some of the things he'd said, but it just didn't catch root in the campaign. Were really dangerous. When he was blaming the birth control pill for sex trafficking, at a minister's meeting, I realized he would say whatever he needed to say in front of whatever audience he was in front of. But people didn't care because it was Trump, and Trump embraced him, and he was Trump's guy. So all the problems with what he had espoused, he was way more extreme than Todd Aiken. Way more extreme than Todd Aiken.
And just to play devil's advocate, there could be some people who are like, Jim Talent lost to you and he never says a bad thing about you. Like, why would you take a different approach than that? Just because you're different people, basically?
I think so. I've never said a bad thing about Jim Talent, and I've never said a bad thing about Matt Blunt. It's not that I get that when you lose, you can be a bad loser. and you can put down the person you lost. And frankly, I don't make it a habit I have certainly tweeted some things about Josh Hawley, particularly since January 6th. But I spend much more time talking about the problems in the Republican Party and the civil war they have on their hands between the Trump base and what I call the Danforth Republicans.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Well, let's look a little bit more forward-looking and talk about the future of Missouri Democrats. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask you. One of the things that I noticed, especially after Roy Blunt got elected to the Senate, is you two seem to have a pretty good working relationship, even though you ran against his son and his dad ran against your mom in a state rep race. I've talked to Joe Manis about this. I'm like, how is that possible? How could somebody work well with somebody who was a political rival not for multiple generations? I just kind of got the sense that you two are politically mature enough to set aside things when you have to actually work together and you actually maybe respected each other. Like what was with that? I've always been really interested in that.
I think that's true. I think there is mutual respect there. I think political maturity also has something to do with it. And by the way, that's very out of vogue now. I mean, I remember back in the time when they used to say being an incumbent is such an advantage. These days in the Missouri Republican Party, all you need to do is wave a gun around at black people and you can be a candidate for United States Senate. I mean, that's how crazy it's gotten. So a lack of experience is a good thing now politically. People have this jaundiced, cynical view of anybody who's done politics. Now, by the way, this doesn't apply in any other career choice. I mean, if you start in the mailroom and work your way up to the CEO of the company, you're lauded as the American dream. If you start in the mailroom, which I did as an intern in the Missouri legislature, and work your way up to the United States Senate, man, get her out of there. She's been around too long. So Roy and I both had similar experience. We both did county government. We both did state government. We both, believe in going out and actually appearing and being in front of the people we work for. He spent a lot of time traveling around Missouri as district as a congressman and the whole state as a senator. I did the same thing. So we related to one another and we liked each other as people. And I was just somebody who always believed. I mean, Kit and I got along fine, too. He was really irritated at me because I thought earmarks were really bad, and earmarks were his coin of the realm. But other than that, Kit and I got along fine and still do. I referenced it earlier in the conversation. Yeah. I consider Roy Blunt a friend of mine, and now there's no political downside to admitting it.
I wasn't surprised he decided not to run again. Let's take aside that he didn't vote to object to the Electoral College. He's like 71. He's been senator twice. He was Secretary of State twice. I don't think he really has anything else to prove anymore. He's not going to be Senate Majority Leader because there's two other people ahead of him. There is really some benefit in just being like, okay, I've done a lot of things. I want to go do something other than being in elected office. Now, there could be some conspiracy theories that he didn't think he was going to win, but he told me that Trump called him and said, I will endorse you anywhere, even though he has stood up to Trump a couple times. Not just the Electoral College, but he was against his tariff policy too, which is not a small deal. So it kind of just shows that you don't necessarily have to agree with Trump for him to like you, which is probably a whole nother conversation.
Well, look at Elise Stefanik. I mean, she voted against his tax bill, for gosh sakes.
Yeah.
And they've anointed her as leadership. But yeah, I wouldn't have run again if there was anybody else. Jason had just lost. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of me had hoped that Jason would wait and run. But I don't blame him. He wanted to go for an open seat, and it looked ultimately winnable, and frankly, it would have been had the national politics not been so prevalent that year. If he'd been in a non-presidential year, I think Jason would have won.
Yes.
But there really wasn't anybody else that was willing to run. Mm-hmm. And so I felt a duty to run. Roy doesn't have that problem. There's plenty of people that want to run. In fact, there's 1,000 thousands of people that want to run for his seat. And he's been in Congress long enough to see, and I saw it too, and it's really bad now, people who didn't know when to leave. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of people there that should be gone. They are way too old to be doing what they're doing. And it is really not good because they're not who they were. They are mere shells of the senators they used to be. And that's, and Roy has a close family. I have a close family. I mean, I've told him, you're going to love it out here. He's going to have lots of opportunities. I mean, he'll have some opportunities I don't have because he doesn't have a big mouth like I do. I mean, I'm sure there'll be boards that will be dying to have Roy Blunt serve on corporate boards.
I mentioned Matt Blunt earlier. I talked with him in 2019. I did not get any sense that he missed being in electoral politics.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm sure that he could show Roy Blunt the way about enjoying yourself.
Right.
But I want to talk about kind of how the Senate race is going to go. There really isn't like the obvious person to run for this cast of thousands against Republicans. Like I mentioned this on Twitter, you have to go back to 1994, the last time there was a Democratic U.S. Senate candidate that was not either a statewide official or an incumbent. And it's looking, unless Jay Nixon decides to run, which I really doubt he's going to do. I think he's enjoying being out of office too. You're going to have either a former state senator or somebody who has never run for office before run against either a former governor, an attorney general, a member of Congress. On the surface, it doesn't look good for the Missouri Democrats. Like, what do you think?
I think it's a little early, and I think it all depends on how the Republican primary plays out. The fact that Eric Greitens is leading in the polls gives me hope. Everyone who says, Eric Greitens is a shoo-in to be the next United States Senator, I don't believe that. And I'm not sure most Republicans that are thinking clearly believe that. The more people that get in, the more his chances of winning go up.
Unless there's a runoff. I'm sure you were following that in Jefferson City. I think that the Republicans really want a runoff to box him out.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Or you could get McCaskill versus Greitens as the top two. That could backfire as well.
You could. So I think it all depends on how their primary plays out. I think Jay might run. I'm not breaking a story here. I think he might run. I think he, the coalition you have to put together in Missouri is, as you said, it's very tough because you have to just hang the moon in the progressive blue areas of the state, and then you have to cut the margins in rural Missouri. I think Jay can cut the margins in rural Missouri. I think he would have some work to do to make sure that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was enthusiastic about him, because he had always done the political exercise of moderation, cutting the margins in the rural areas, but a good example, the last time Jay ran statewide, the boot heel didn't look like what the boot heel looks like now.
No, it did not.
I mean, people don't realize how politics have shifted, particularly in the boot heel. Southwest Missouri is no longer the epicenter of the Missouri Republican Party.
Southeast Missouri.
It's Southeast Missouri.
And
Jason Smith is in a commanding position in terms of that Senate race.
Right.
If he were to get the Trump endorsement and he were to run, then he, I think, waxes Eric Schmidt. I think Eric Schmidt, I don't care how much he pretends that he's a right-winger, he's not. He's a moderate Republican that is pretending to be a right-winger. But I don't care how much he pretends to be a right-winger. I don't think he could overcome Jason Smith if Jason got Trump's endorsement and ran.
I want to talk about the decline of rural Missouri, because yes, this has been a pet issue of mine, but I think it's a really important thing to talk about. I've spent some time over the pandemic traveling around Southeast Missouri. I've gone to state parks, and I've also visited towns. Some towns are prosperous, like Cape Girardeau. Others, like Charleston and Doniphan, there's basically nothing there anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's because some cities diversified economically and others didn't. But the common thing is Trump is just wildly popular there. I see signs everywhere I go, from St. Genevieve to Ripley County to... Iron County, which voted for Barack Obama. Why do you think it's changed? And is there any way back for Missouri Democrats in that part of the state?
It's really a head scratcher. I think what Donald Trump did, he's a master marketer, and he tapped the vein of, I'm getting screwed over, I'm an other, people look past me. He tapped that vein. He spoke directly to those people. He said things that you're not supposed to say if you're running for president of the United States. He talked like they talked at, the VFW hall, having a beer and a chaser. And he really appealed to the grievance that people have about how their lives have turned out. I mean, what's the bottom line is, people have worked harder, worked longer. They still can't afford to retire. They can't afford to send their kids to college. They can't afford to take a vacation. And that is, there's a palpable grievance that's wrapped up in that reality. They're not doing better than their parents did. And they don't see their kids doing better than their parents did. And so that's what Donald Trump figured out. And he made it all about the Mexicans and the Muslims, and he made it all about the other, that they're all getting free stuff, you're not. Donald Trump was really good at finding that grievance and relating to it and making that the centerpiece of who he was. And that remains. And it's going to remain that way until they finally look around and realize the reason that rural Missouri is struggling is because hospitals are closing. It's because roads are crumbling. It's because bridges are dangerous. It's because schools are not getting funded. It's because we're not attracting businesses to Missouri because it's seen by national business leaders as kind of a backward place now. This is not, we don't have the Sun Belt that puts us up in competition. We don't have the great weather. We don't have the things that they have in Arizona or they have in Texas or they have in Colorado, or, we don't have that. So you have to have policies that guarantee logistics, that guarantee a workforce, that guarantee health care, and none of those things are happening with the leadership of the Missouri Republican Party. So you're going to see a dwindling of economic prosperity, except for agriculture, in rural Missouri. Until some of those things change.
Do you think that the ideological sorting of both parties has played a role too? And here's what I mean by that. I don't think that conservative Democrats, and I'm being specific here, pro-union, pro-social safety net, anti-abortion rights, anti-gun control, I don't think that they are a viable part of the Democratic coalition anymore. And conversely, socially liberal Republicans aren't part of that coalition either. I'm from suburban Chicago. Mark Kirk was my congressman for many years, and then he became a senator. He was pro-choice, pro-gun control, pro-LGBTQ rights, very hawkish on foreign policy, and also, would vote for any tax cuts. But that type of Republican doesn't get elected anymore for various reasons. And you don't see, with the exception of Joe Manchin, because I guess he's a political master and a political monster, as Brian Davis once called Chris Koster, by the way. You don't really see that type of Democrat anymore either. So I think when a rural Missouri voter looks at the National Democratic Party, and they may have leanings toward some of the things I mentioned, like being pro-union or pro-Medicare, Medicaid, they're like, well, everyone is pro-choice and pro-gun control. There's no place for me anymore. And I know that some Democrats, especially here, have rejected that and have said we got to go more on what we believe in and not pander to that. So that's a long wind-up, but I'd be interested in your opinion.
The Republican Party has done a very good job of putting the cultural issues front and center: guns, abortion, gay rights, and to some extent immigration. I mean, rural Missouri depends on immigrant labor.
Yeah, and I can't say Missouri Democrats have been very progressive on that either.
No.
Not you.
No.
Not
I
Chris
remember
Koster.
when we were considering immigration reform, and they called me wanting me to go around the state and hold, town halls on immigration reform. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Farm Bureau was, of course, behind the bill. They wanted the bill. And I said, if you get Missouri Farm Bureau to do it with me, I'll be happy to do it. Well,
They
And by the way, when I told people in rural Missouri that Farm Bureau supported immigration reform, they said I was a liar. So, here's the thing. I think that the cultural issues will continue to divide us. I also think Donald Trump has chased a lot of educated Republicans into the Democrats' arms. And I don't think that's going to change in the next several cycles. It's an interesting quandary for somebody like Ann Wagner. Ann Wagner is from the Kit Bond, Jack Danforth wing of the Republican Party, like Roy Blunt. She's not from the Trump wing. And by the way, so is Eric Schmidt. They're all from what I would call the normal Republican wing of the Republican Party. And, she did a great job in defeating a formidable opponent 2 years ago. But it doesn't appear to me that she's trying to throw elbows to win this primary. And I could make an argument that one candidate who would speak to fiscal responsibility and economic prosperity and protecting small businesses, that they could win a Republican primary if there's enough candidates in it. And she would be a likely one that could win it if there were enough candidates in it, if you didn't have the runoff situation.
Right. Well, this is the reason why we're talking today. Right beside you are baked goods from Nathaniel Reed Bakery, because I said on Twitter while I was sitting on a bench in Doniphan, Missouri during one of my rural pandemic mental health exercises that I didn't think that Biden would get over 60% in St. Louis County. I will be honest with you, Senator. I knew I was going to lose that bet, but I just wanted to have a fun, post-election bet. But yeah, there has been growth in the Democratic fortunes here in St. Louis County. Kirkwood used to be a 50-50 place, 65-35 Democrat. Webster Groves used to be 50-50. I think it voted 75 or 85%. I live in Richmond Heights, the 5th County Council District, which used to be a Republican used to hold it. 80-20 Democrat right now. And even parts of West County are starting to get purplish. But as you mentioned, Ann Wagner won by 6, and Andrew Koenig beat Deb Lavender. Like, how do you explain that type of phenomenon?
That
basically?
Deb Lavender race is a real head scratcher for me. I if I were going to Monday morning quarterback, I would probably have gone for Andrew Koenig's kneecaps more aggressively than they did, because he is a right wing guy. He is way out of step with his district. That district is, I won that Senate seat. Mm-hmm. Barely, but I won it.
I think that the reason that he won is he went door to door pretty ferociously, and I don't think Deb Lavender did. It was probably because she didn't want to go door to door during a
because
pandemic.
of COVID.
But
yeah,
there is some value in meeting voters face to face. I would assume that I saw tweets of Wagner going door to door in the last couple weeks. I'm sure she did something similar. She's a very smart political operator. But continue.
Well, I just think that you're going to continue to see the ideological partisanship in Missouri as long as it keeps working for the Republican Party. And power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. They have absolute power now. They cannot blame any Democrat for anything. So when jobs don't grow, when there's a bridge that collapses, when there anything that happens, they own it all now. And eventually there will be a scandal. Now, you would think the Greiton scandal would be enough. Taping up your mistress in the basement of your own house while your wife's gone, and ripping open her shirt and spitting water in her face. You would think that would be enough.
Well, I got to just say this, Senator. I know that before that House report came out, I don't think you were part of the people who thought he should resign. I assume you wanted his woes to hurt Josh Hawley, and you made that calculation. And I think you two both called on him to resign within 8 minutes of each other. But that was your calculation there, right?
Well, it first of all, it didn't help me politically to call for his resignation. It being in the headlines helped me politically. And he wasn't going to, up until then, there was no likelihood that he was going to resign.
And I think Roy Blunt went on some national show and didn't call on him to resign, and people were mad at him for doing that. But I was sort of like, do you really think if Roy Blunt went on Face the Nation or Meet the Press and called on Greitens to resign, he's going to do it? Like,
Right.
Of course not.
It's a little bit like Matt Gaetz.
Right. I don't think that that's a
Matt
successful...
Gaetz, I think, will eventually resign. And I will criticize those people who are not at least removing him from committees at this point. I don't think I've said for him to resign, but they should take him off committees at this point, especially Judiciary Committee. But it is one of those situations where Greitens, it wasn't, it was a combination of things that Greitens represented. And people need to remember it was the Republican Party that chased him out of Jefferson City. It wasn't the Democrats.
Right. And obviously Democrats didn't have any power to do that. But I do take him seriously. Like, there are a lot of people in Missouri and Republican politics, voters I'm talking about, who will vote for him, no matter what millions of dollars are spent against him. So you mentioned that you think Democrats can take an opportunity on that, but there are a lot of political observers who think that the party is in such bad shape that someone like Greitens wins the primary. He's a U.S. senator. Like, how do you avoid that?
I don't think he is. First of all, if Greitens has to be careful, because if he goes too far and he calls this woman a liar, the thing that, in talking to people who listen to her testify, and I spent a lot of time in a courtroom, as you know, Jason, with victims of sexual assault on the stand. Credibility is really important, and you can smell when somebody's telling the truth in those situations. And everyone said this woman was totally credible. In fact, they even said in the House report, this was a credible witness, and this was Republicans that said this. So if she were to come forward, I guess there's another wife that's back there somewhere that's never come forward and talked. I just think when there's bad things you've done in your life, you can assume if you try to gain power, they're going to come out. Didn't hurt Donald Trump, and that's Greitens' calculation that it won't hurt him.
One other question before I let you go. You said that you're enjoying being out of political office. I can kind of tell. Is there anything you miss about being in elected office?
I miss the collegiality of it. I miss, being able to see my friends, every Monday night, and during the week, and having lunch with them, my fellow senators. I miss the personal interactions that come with politics. I actually even miss walking into a town hall in a place where I know 90% of the audience would just as soon see me ride off on a broom.
I have to say, the reason I talk about my trips to rural Missouri so much is I loved traveling to rural Missouri, not only because they have great state parks there, but a lot of those towns I mentioned have tremendous history involved in it. Like Charleston, Missouri, that's where Warren Hearns is from.
Right.
There's a big bus there. There's a museum, but it was closed. I would have gone into there for sure. I know you probably love this state more than I do, but I do love traveling to different parts of the state.
Yeah, so I miss that part. I miss the interaction with people, and it's been heightened by COVID because there's not a whole lot of interaction. But on the list of sides of things I miss versus the list of sides of things I don't miss, the don't miss is much longer than the miss.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet.
For all of our stories, stlpr.org. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. Follow me on Twitter, Jay Rosenbaum. Claire CMC on Twitter?
Yep, Claire CMC on Twitter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
From St. Louis Public Radio, this is Politically Speaking.